Okay, so in this video, I want to cover two topics. I believe there is a first topic in chapter 2, which is develop a simple circular flow of income, including the content of GDP. And there is another one in chapter 4, I believe it's 4.9, which is about a complete circular flow of income, the one with leakages and injections, and to explain the different interrelationships between economic agents. So let's start with the concept of circular flow of income. Then we'll look at the simple model. We'll highlight how we can use this diagram to illustrate GDP and it's the different methods in which we can measure GDP. And then we'll talk about leakages and injections and we'll look at a broader picture. So basically the circular flow of income, it's an economic model. So it's a simplified version of reality. And the main objective of the circular flow of income is to describe the way in which goods and services, resources, and money flow throughout the economy between economic agents. In its most simple presentation, we only analyze the relationships between two key economic agents, households and firms. So we'll make a few simplifying assumptions. Number one, in the simplified model, we are in a closed economy, meaning that there are no imports, no exports, no rest of the world. There is no government, or at least no government intervention. There are no taxes, no government spending. And three, there are no financial markets. What it means is that economic agents can't save money, they can't borrow money. So of course, these assumptions are not very realistic, but they do help to come up with a simplified version of an economy to really understand its core, the core of the economy. So in this case, when we introduce these assumptions, there are basically only two economic agents. On the one hand, we have funds, I should say the domestic funds, because there are no imports, no exports. So these are the funds, which are basically the producers, and there are individuals, usually we call them households, which are essentially the consumers, but in fact, they have two, they are consumers, but they are also workers. Consumers, workers. And these two economic agents, these two categories of economic agents, they are going to meet in those places where buyers and sellers meet, which we call markets. And they will meet in two different types of markets. First, they will meet in a place that we call resource markets or factor markets, the same thing. A resource market or factor market is a market in which we trade a factor of production, a resource, a productive resource. So remember that in economics, we usually identify 4 factors of production. We have land, which includes all natural resources. We have labor, basically workers. We have capital, so capital is any man-made resource, like a machine, for example, or even raw materials. And finally, we have enterprise or entrepreneurship, which is basically those entrepreneurs, those who will try to set up a business and to produce something. Because of course, even if you have land, labor, and capital, if you don't have like someone, an entrepreneur that is just going to take initiative, to take risk and say, all right, let's produce this item, this good or this service with these or the other resources that I have, nothing is going to happen. So we need someone, several person, entrepreneurs to combine those resources to organize production. So these are the main factors of production in an economy. And in this simplified model, we assume that households are the ones who own those resources. Okay, so households are the ones who have the factors of production. They are the ones who own the natural resources. They own their own workforce, of course. They own capital goods. And well, among those households, there are some entrepreneurs. But honestly, to simplify the presentation, it's okay if we focus on labor because it's basically the one that is going to be the easiest for us to understand. But whatever I explain using the example of labor, remember that it's also valid to, it also applies to other factors of production. So what happens is that, well, households and firms, they are going to meet in those resource markets. Why? Because of course, firms to produce goods and services, they need factors of production. So in resource markets, firms are going to buy resources, to purchase resources from households, and households, they are going to, I don't know where to write it, so this board is a bit small, households are going to sell, okay? So the suppliers are the households and the demand comes from firms. So essentially what happens is that households are going to sell resources to firms. And of course, in exchange or in return, households are going to receive money. So from the perspective of firms, the money that they pay to buy resources, we sometimes call them, that's a cost, or that's some kind, it's a production cost. Okay, it's the money that is used by the firms to pay for the factors of production. So from that perspective, it's a cost. And from the perspective of households, it's a form of income. So remember that each factor of production has a corresponding income. Labor, wages. Okay. Land, rent. Capital, interest. Enterprise, profit. These are just names. Do not try to find any logic behind them. There is none. Rent, wages, interest, profit. Okay. Of course, firms, they don't buy resources just for the sake of it. They are going to use those resources to produce consumer goods and services that they will be able to sell to households. So they are firms and households, they are also going to meet in what we call product markets. Product markets are markets in which we trade final goods and services. In this case, they are only households, so only final consumer goods and services. So anything that you can buy on a daily basis, you buy it in a product market. Most individuals, the only interaction they have with businesses in the resource market is when they look for a job in the labor market. So interestingly enough, what happens now is that firms in product markets, they do not buy, but they sell. Okay, so the roles are basically flipped. Firms, they sell, and clearly households now they buy. And of course, from firms to households, there is a physical flow of goods and services. G and S stands for goods and services. So it's a physical flow, just like the resources, the physical flow. We're not talking about money. And in exchange, households will have to give money to firms to purchase those goods and services. So from the household's perspective, it's an expenditure. So just write EXP because I don't have much room on spending. It's an expenditure. They spend money to purchase those goods and services. And from the firm's perspective, it's a revenue. So just REV for revenue. Okay, so that's essentially the simple circular flow of income. Now, let's talk about GDP a bit. GDP, first, it stands for gross domestic product. And what it measures is the total value of final goods and services that have produced within an economy over a given period of time. So careful, we are not talking about the quantities, we are talking about the value, the market value of all those final goods and services. Why final means that it's a finished product. We don't include products that are semi-finished, products that are not finished, and I'll just tell you why. Take a simple example of a car and a company producing a car and a company producing steel and then selling the steel to the car company. Steel is not a final product. It's a raw material that is going to be purchased by the car company and the company is going to sell cars, okay? So imagine that the steel company has produced for $1 million of steel and the car company has produced for $2 million of cars. Should we include the output of both companies when calculating GDP? No. And you understand that this would be a problem because remember I said that the car company has produced for $2 million of cars, but within those $2 million, there is the value of steel because the value of steel is part of the value of the car. So if we count the value of the car and the value of steel, you see that we count the value of the steel twice. So that's why we only focus on the value of final goods and services in order to avoid situations where we would count the same output twice, basically. So let me repeat the definition: the market value, so measured in dollars or whatever currency, of all final products that have been produced within an economy, domestic product, over a given period of time. Here, gross just means that we do not subtract the depreciation of capital equipment in the economy, but that's a detail. And in fact, there are three ways to measure GDP in an economy because this value can be calculated in different ways. The first method, which is the most common, is what we call the expenditure method. Second one is the income method. And third one is the output method. According to the expenditure method, we are simply going to count how much money has been spent on final domestic products over a given period of time. That's it. So imagine as soon as someone in the economy, so in our simplified model, there are only households, right, who buy final products. So as soon as a household buys something from a firm, we just register the amount, and we add up all of this expenditure, and we will find what the total GDP is. In fact, I'll explain the output method because it's easier to relate it to the expenditure method. The output method, it just consists in counting or measuring the value of what has been produced. So every time a firm has produced something, like, just try to imagine someone whose job would be to measure GDP. So we have someone in the factory, and as soon as something has been produced, something is finished and is ready to be sold, we have someone that just say, okay, so how much are you going to sell it for? What's the value of what we've just produced? That's the output method. So we don't really look at how much has been spent, but basically how much has been produced. And of course, these two methods are equivalent because how much has been produced is exactly the same as the total market value of what has been produced is exactly the same as the amount of money that has been spent in the economy. Then you could tell me, but again, that's a detail. What if we produce something but we don't sell it? You would be right? It's possible we produce something, so we count it here, but we have not yet sold it. But remember that in that case, this would mean that our stocks would go up because we've produced something, but we have not yet sold it. And an increase in stocks is regarded as an investment. And investment is a form of expenditure, but that's, again, a detail. And finally, the income method, we, instead of counting how much people have spent, or instead of counting how much firms have produced, we simply count how much money has been given to the factors of production. And when you think about it, of course, this amount has to be equal, exactly equal to how much money has been spent and to the value of production. Because, again, just let's look at it in a very simple way. The expenditure method is how much people have spent. So that's also how much firms have received. And firms, once they receive money from households, they just give it away to factors of production. They use this money to pay wages, to pay rent, to pay interest, and to pay profit. And there is no money left, right? Therefore, how much money has been spent by households is exactly equal to how much money is going to be received by them. And we can use the circular flow of income to identify these three flows in a quite simple way. So I'm just going to do the same model, but a simplified version. Oops. Households. And again, we have the resource market and the product markets. So remembering in the resource markets, basically here we have the income. I'll just put it this way. And here money flows this way. That's household spending. And basically what goes from here to here, this is goods and services. And this is FOP, factors of production. Okay, it's the same, just to slightly simplify. Okay, so let's now try to identify GDP, gross domestic products, and in particular, let's try to identify the three flows that correspond to those three methods. And of course, you see that they are equivalent, that all of these arrows, in fact, they measure the same flow. Let's start with the expenditure method. Simple. Households are the ones who spend money. And so the expenditure method is going to be these flow. That's the expenditure method. The income method is just how much money has been received by the factors of production, which is, I'll use a different color, which is this one. You see that they are the same, because all the money that is received by firms when it sells goods and services to households is immediately given back to households in the form of income. from the rent, wages, interest, and profits. It's going in circles, so the flow here is the same as the flow that we have there. Do I have another color? No. Just a second. Right. The output method, it's the value of the goods and services, of the final goods and services that have been produced by firms, and it can be identified by this flow. That's basically the value. That's the value of the goods and services that have been produced. And of course, these value, the value of the goods and services that have been produced and sold to households, is the same as the value of the money that goes from households to firms. Okay, if households pay $1,000 to firms, well, that's because the good that they have purchased is worth $1,000. Okay, so that's the simple circular flow of income. With the explanation of GDP and how we can use the circular flow of income to identify GDP in various ways. Now, I think we are ready to look into the extended circular flow of income. So in the extended circular flow of income, basically we want the economy to be a bit more realistic. And so we are going to relax some of the very demanding assumptions that we have made earlier. So in the extended model, we are now going to consider an open economy. So an open economy is an economy that trades with the rest of the world. So there will be imports and exports. There is a government, meaning that there will be taxes as well as government spending and subsidies and benefits, but let's keep it simple. And there are financial markets. The importance of financial markets is that now economic agents can save and borrow. Okay, so let's try to represent this extended circular flow. I'm just gonna show the flows of money in this case. So we have firms, we have households. I can't spell right tonight. And up, so here from firms to households, it's income. And from households to firms, it's spending, expenditure. Okay, so that's basically what we had before. I should add domestic firms and domestic households. Domestic firms and domestic. Domestic means from my country, right? Domestic firms, domestic households, because there are also firms abroad, because we live in an open economy, and there are households abroad as well. Okay, now let's start with income. Now that households receive income, they might not be able to keep everything because there is a government, and this government may collect some direct taxes, like income tax, for example. So some of this income is going to leak. I'll talk about leakages later. Some of this income is not going to flow back to households, but it's going to go to the government. Key for taxes, mostly direct taxes in this case. So the consumer pays income tax, and then is left with a certain amount of money that we call the disposable income. But this consumer may not necessarily spend everything. Okay, now that they are financial markets, some of this disposable income may be saved. Okay, so some of this income may also go to, let's just say, banks. Form of savings. S is for savings. Okay, so we've paid our taxes, we've saved some, so of course what's left, we consume it, we spend it. But do we necessarily spend it on domestic products? Do we necessarily spend these income on goods and services that have been produced by domestic firms? Maybe not. Maybe the consumer is going to use this income, some of this income, to import some goods from abroad. So that's the rest of the world. ROTW, the rest of the world. So you see that basically not all of the income that is paid to households will flow back to domestic firms, because some of it is going to be taken away by the government, some of it is going to be saved, and some of it is going to go abroad to purchase goods and services from foreign companies. All of these are called leakages. Or withdrawals. Usually we use the letter W. How do we define them? It's just income that does not flow back to domestic firms. It's basic, and that's why we call it a leakage. It's as if this income leaked from the circle. It does not return to domestic firms. It goes to someone else, either to the government in the form of taxes, to banks in the form of savings, or abroad in the forms of imports. But on the other hand, the government takes and the government gives. So now that the government has collected tax revenue, the government can also buy goods and services from domestic firms. Basically, the point is that now that we have more economic agents, we do not only have households, but we also have the government, banks, and the rest of the world. The point is that households are not necessarily the only ones who buy goods and services from domestic firms, because sometimes the government, our own government, can purchase goods and services from domestic firms. Could be, for example, if the government decides to build a new road. So it's going to spend money to buy basically a new road or a new airport or a new railway line. Just could be public education. We have to public healthcare. We have to build a hospital. There are so many goods and services that are purchased by the government. So, which means that, and I'm going to use a different color, some of the government can also add to the spending by domestic households. Domestic households will buy goods and services from domestic firms, but so will the government. The government will also buy goods and services. We usually write a G, and it's usually called government purchases. Why not government spending? Because remember, and that's an important point, remember that this does not include transfer payments. This does not include benefits like pensions or sickness benefits or child benefits. This only includes goods and services that are purchased by the government, no transfer payments. Besides, now that there are financial markets, it becomes possible for domestic firms to borrow money to finance investment spending. So remember that in economics, investment refers to the purchase of capital goods, mostly fixed capital goods by firms. Say, oh, a firm wants to build a new factory, wants to buy a new machine, something like that. It costs a lot of money, and very often firms have to borrow money for that. In the simple circular flow of income, this was not possible, simply because we did not have financial markets. But now it is possible, now that we have banks and that we have people who have saved money. So there is money that is available to be borrowed. So basically the point is that now, in addition to domestic households buying goods from domestic firms, and the government also buying goods from domestic firms, you also have domestic firms buying goods from other domestic firms. For example, a car company buying a machine from a machine company. Okay, these are two domestic firms, and one can be producing a machine for the other. And it's made possible through the banking system. Okay, this investment, when one firm is going to buy a capital good from another domestic firm, is made possible through the financial markets, and that's why we usually represent it like that. We say that, oh, through banks we can have investment, and you know that investment is a form of spending. It is not spending on consumer goods like households, but it is spending on capital goods. But in any event, it is a form of spending. So that's an additional spending that now exists in this extended circular flow. And finally, and this one is quite easy to understand, we have the rest of the world. So it could be foreign households, foreign businesses, or even foreign government, and they might want to buy our products. They might want to buy goods and services that have been produced by our companies. And this is what we call exports. Exports. So you see that those three items here, what they are essentially non-household spending on domestic products. Why non-household? Because it's spending that comes from the government, from firms themselves, through banks, through the financial system. But when we talk about investment, it's spending by domestic firms or the rest of the world. So it's, I repeat, spending, or I should say non-household spending on domestic products. Basically, spending on domestic products that is not generated by households, but that instead is generated by the government, by firms themselves, and by the rest of the world. And that's precisely what we call an injection. Usually injections, because they are free, and usually we use the letter J for injection. Okay, conclusion. What if injections are greater than leakages? Imagine, it's like if you have imagine a bucket of water. So the bucket of water, and let's make it transparent. So there is water inside, but there are some holes. And so you have some water that just leaks from the bucket. These are the leakages, saving, taxes, imports. So at the same time, just copy that later. At the same time, you have three pipes that just add water to the bucket. This is government spending, investments, exports. Okay, so these are the three injections. These are the three leakages. Well, imagine if the flow of water into the bucket is greater than the flow of water outside of the bucket. So basically, if injections are greater than leakages, W for withdrawal, then we see that the the amount of water in the bucket will increase gradually, right? Because we have more water coming in than coming out. And it will eventually spill over. In our context, we're not talking about water, we're talking about income. This means that the national income will rise, will increase at each circle, each loop, basically. The amount of income that is flowing throughout the economy is increasing, which indicates economic growth. On the other hand, if withdrawals are greater than injections, so there is more, these are the withdrawals, right? So there is more money flowing out than money flowing in. Well, in this case, as you can imagine, the amount of water in the bucket will decrease and it will eventually run out. In our context, this means that GDP would fall gradually, that national income at every loop of the circular flow of income, every circle, the amount of income that is flowing throughout the economy is falling. And final situation, but I'm not going to talk about that too much, would be a situation where they are equal, where the amount of water that comes into the bucket is exactly the same as the amount of water that leaks from the bucket. If these two are equal, then the amount of water would basically remain constant. This is something that we sometimes call a stationary state. We'll stay there. Stationary state meaning that it doesn't change. We will always have the same amount of water unless there is an external shock. Okay, I think that's it. You know everything there is to know about the circular flow of income.